My name is Sandra May. I am 44 years old. I live in Franklin, Tennessee, in a house with a wraparound porch and a kitchen I designed myself, down to the cabinet hardware, down to the specific shade of white on the walls that took me 11 samples to get exactly right. I own a boutique interior design firm called May & Co. that I built from a single client referral 12 years ago into a company with 4 employees, a waiting list, and a reputation that reaches into Nashville and beyond. I have been married to Derek May for 11 years, and for the last 8 months of those 11 years, I sat across from a marriage counselor named Dr. Patricia Ellison every Tuesday at 4 o'clock and tried to explain what was wrong with my marriage, while my husband sat beside me and explained what was wrong with me. I want to tell you something before this story begins. I am not a dramatic woman. I do not catastrophize. I do not manufacture crises. I do not, as Derek told Dr. Ellison on our 4th session, with the calm certainty of a man who has been rehearsing his lines, have a tendency to misread situations and assign meaning that isn't there. I am a woman who notices things. I notice the way light falls differently in a room when something has shifted. I notice when a color is wrong by 3 degrees. I notice when a conversation has a shape that doesn't match its words. I notice the pause before an answer that is 1/2 second longer than it needs to be. I notice the way a hand moves toward a phone on a table and then stops. I notice everything. And for 11 years, I was with a man who had decided that my noticing was a character flaw. It took me a long time to understand that the character flaw wasn't mine, but I understand it now, and by the time this story is finished, you will understand it too. Before I tell you what happened on that Tuesday in Dr. Ellison's office and what I did about it over the 60 days that followed, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Your city, your state, your country. Drop it below so we know we're not sitting in this alone. Let's begin. I need to take you back, not to the counselor's office, not to the Tuesday everything cracked open. I need to take you back 6 years before that Tuesday, to the version of my life that existed before I understood what was living inside it, because I think you need to see what normal looked like from the outside before I show you what it looked like from the inside, and I think you need to understand the woman I was before the erosion started, so that when I describe what the erosion did to her, you understand what was being taken. Franklin, Tennessee is a beautiful town. It has the kind of main street that makes people slow their cars down without meaning to. Old brick buildings, coffee shops with handwritten menus, a farmer's market on Saturday mornings where the same families have had the same tables for 20 years. Christmas lights that go up the week after Thanksgiving and stay so perfectly maintained through the season that out-of-town visitors sometimes stop to take photographs of them. It is the kind of place where people put down roots and mean it. Derek and I moved here 9 years ago when his company relocated its regional office. We drove through Franklin on a Saturday morning looking at houses, and both of us felt it at the same time, that specific settling sensation of a place recognizing you as much as you recognize it. We bought the house on Sycamore Lane 2 weeks later. 3 bedrooms, wraparound porch, a backyard that backed up to a creek you could hear on quiet evenings, a kitchen that needed everything done to it, which I took as an opportunity rather than a problem, because that is how I have always looked at spaces that aren't yet what they could be. I spent 4 months on that kitchen, every decision made by hand, every sample held against the light at different times of day, the specific white on the walls, not bright white, not cream, but something in between that changed character between morning and evening in a way that made the room feel alive. Took 11 samples and 3 weeks to find. Derek would come home to the progress reports and the paint samples taped to the wall, and he would say, "Only you would spend 3 weeks on a paint color." He said it with affection then. Later he would say the same kind of thing differently. But I am not there yet. I need to tell you about May & Co. before I tell you about Derek, because May & Co. is the thread that runs through this entire story, and I want you to understand what it was, what it truly was, before I tell you what Derek tried to do with it. It started with a referral. A woman named Helen Marsh, who lived 3 streets over, needed her living room redesigned before her daughter's wedding reception. A mutual friend gave me my name. I had been doing small design projects as a freelancer for 2 years while working part-time at an architecture firm in Nashville, building a portfolio one project at a time with the specific patience of someone who understands that things built carefully last longer than things built quickly. Helen Marsh's living room took me 3 weeks. I charged her $4,000. When I finished it, she stood in the doorway of her own room and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How did you know?" I said, "Know what?" She said, "How did you know it was supposed to look like this? I didn't even know it was supposed to look like this." I said, "I just listened to the room." She looked at me over her shoulder. She said, "I'm going to tell everyone I know." She told 2 friends that week. Those 2 told 4 more. Those 4 told 8. Within 18 months, I had more work than I could handle alone, and a waiting list that was beginning to feel less like a problem and more like evidence of something real. I hired Priya first. Priya Sharma had graduated from SCAD 6 months earlier and applied for the position with a portfolio that made me sit down when I opened it. She had the gift, the real gift, the one you cannot teach, of understanding how a space felt to be inside before she touched it. We have worked together 9 years now, and I consider her one of the most talented designers I have ever encountered. Then James, who could organize a 12-room renovation project across 4 contractors without raising his voice or missing a deadline. Then Theo, who brought a quality of visual thinking to our team that expanded what we were capable of offering. And then Claudette. Claudette deserves her own introduction because she is not a supporting character in this story. She is the reason this story ends the way it does. Claudette is 51 years old. She grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, the second of 4 children, in a household where everyone worked and nobody wasted anything, and the ability to look at a problem clearly, without sentiment, without drama, without the particular blindness that comes from wanting things to be different than they are, was considered a basic life skill rather than a special talent. She moved to Franklin 14 years ago after a divorce that she describes, depending on her mood, as either the best financial decision she ever made or the most expensive education she ever received. She came to me as a client. I redesigned her home office, a room she used for the financial consulting work she had been doing independently since her divorce, a kind of space that says, "I am surviving," rather than "I am living." We talked for 6 hours that first day, about the design, about her work, about what she wanted the room to feel like when she sat in it alone at 7 a.m. before the rest of the day arrived. At the end of those 6 hours, she said, "You need someone to run the business side of what you're building. I need something to build. I think we should talk about that." 3 months later, she was my business partner. Claudette manages our finances, our client relationships, our contractor network, our employee reviews, and the 17 other categories of operational complexity that keep May & Co. functioning at the level it functions at. She does all of it with a precision and a loyalty that I did not fully understand how much I depended on until the moment she put a spreadsheet on the table between us and told me what she had found. But that comes later. What I need you to understand right now is that May & Co. was mine. Every client, every referral, every late night over a project that wasn't right yet, every difficult conversation with a contractor, every sample held against the light. Mine. Built from nothing. And Derek knew it. He had watched me build it for 12 years, which is why what he tried to do with it is the thing I find hardest to hold even now. Derek Ney. I have thought carefully about how to describe my husband to you, how to give you the true picture of him rather than the simplified version that a story like this can accidentally create, where the betrayer is a villain from the beginning and the betrayed is a saint throughout. Neither of those things is true. Derek was not a villain from the beginning, and I was not a saint throughout. What Derek was, at the beginning, at the dinner party where we met, in the early years of the marriage, was a man of genuine presence and genuine warmth who had not yet encountered the specific circumstances that would reveal the character underneath the warmth. We met at mutual friends' dinner party in Nashville 13 years ago. I was 31, he was 34. He was the kind of person who made everyone in a conversation feel like the most interesting person in the room. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. He held your eye contact with a steadiness that said, "I am here. I am paying attention. You matter to me right now." I found out much later that this was a technique as much as a quality, but at that dinner party, I did not know that yet. What I knew was that he was interesting, that he was curious about me specifically, about the design work, about how I had come to it, about what it felt like to walk into a room and understand immediately what it needed to become. He said, "That sounds like a way of understanding the world, not just rooms, everything." I said, "Maybe." He said, "Do you do it with people? Walk into a room and understand immediately what they need to become?" I said, "I try not to. People generally prefer to decide that for themselves." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that reaches the eyes. I drove home from that dinner party thinking about that laugh for 20 minutes longer than I intended to. We dated for 2 years. We were married on a Saturday in October at a small venue outside Nashville with 40 people and a string quartet and a dress I had designed myself because after 6 months of looking, I could not find anything that felt exactly right. The first 3 years were good. I want to say that and mean it because I think it is important to be honest about the good years when you are telling the story of what came after. The good years were real. They were not a performance or a strategy or a foundation being laid for something calculated. They were just two people building a life together in the imperfect, ordinary, genuinely loving way that good early marriages work. We had arguments about money and whose turn it was to handle the insurance, and whether the dog, Hector, a 7-year-old rescue lab that Derek had adopted 2 years before we met, was allowed on the furniture. We had Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, and Derek would carry the bags, and I would pick out things we didn't need, and he would pay for them without complaint and say, "We're going to have to start a farm at this rate." We had the kitchen floor moment. I need to tell you about the kitchen floor moment because it is the memory I have returned to more times than I can count during the years of this story. Not to excuse anything, but because it is the truest evidence I have that the man I married was capable of real feeling. Hector died in our 4th year of marriage. He was 11 years old, which for a lab of his size was a full life, and he had been slowing for 6 months in the dignified way of old dogs who had decided to spend their final season being even more present than they already were. He died on Wednesday afternoon when I was with a client. Derek was working from home that day. Derek called me at 3:15. I heard in his voice, before he said a single word, just in the quality of the breath before the first word, that something had happened. He said, "He's gone." I said, "I'm coming home." I left the client meeting. I drove home. Derek was sitting on the kitchen floor when I got there. Not dramatically, just sitting with his back against the cabinet and his knees up, and his face doing the specific things faces do when grief has moved through them already and left something exhausted and open in its place. I sat down on the floor beside him. We didn't say anything for a while. Then Derek said, "He was the best thing I had before you." I put my head on his shoulder. We sat on that kitchen floor for 2 hours. That was real. I know it was real, and I hold it separately from everything that came after, not to excuse it, but because it is a true thing, and true things deserve to be held accurately, even when they coexist with painful ones. The year everything shifted was the 5th year of our marriage. Derek had been working toward a promotion for 2 years, regional vice president of sales, a position that would have meant a significant salary increase, a larger territory, a title that reflected the seniority he had been building toward since he joined the company 8 years earlier. He did not get it. A colleague named Stephen Pierce, 2 years younger than Derek, less experienced in Derek's assessment, and possessed of a particular facility for political maneuvering within corporate structures that Derek had always privately disdained, received the position instead. Derek came home from the office on Thursday they announced it, and I knew before he spoke. I knew because I had learned to read him the way I read rooms, by feeling the atmosphere before I looked at the details. The atmosphere that Thursday was not grief. It was not anger either, exactly. It was something colder and more interior than either. He told me over dinner. He told it factually. He described the decision as short-sighted and political and reflective of a leadership culture that prioritized style over substance. He spoke about it for 20 minutes with a precision and composure that I found more unsettling than an outburst would have been. Then he put his fork down. He looked at his plate for a moment. He said, "I need some time to think." He went to his study. He did not come out until 11. When he came to bed, he was composed and quiet, and I reached for his hand in the dark, and he let me hold it, but he did not hold it back in the specific way he always held my hand in the dark, which was with the pressure of someone who was glad you were there. He just let me hold it, like a man who was somewhere else inside himself. That was the first night I noticed the quality of his absence. Not the absence of his body was right there, the absence of him. And I told myself I was imagining it. That was the first time I used that filter. I need to tell you about the filter because it is the most important thing in this story. More important than the location history, more important than the second phone, more important than the dinner. The filter is why this story takes as long as it does to reach the moment in Dr. Ellison's office, because the filter did not arrive all at once. It was constructed over years, one dismissal at a time, one "you're reading into things" at a time, one "I think you're being too sensitive" at a time, until it was not something Derek was doing to me, it was something I was doing to myself. The filter worked like this. When I noticed something, a pause, a distance, a quality in Derek's voice that did not match what he was saying, I did not trust the noticing immediately. Instead, I ran it through a series of internal questions before I allowed myself to give it weight. Am I being too sensitive? Is this actually something, or am I creating a problem? Am I tired? Stressed? Have I been working too much? Is this about me rather than about him? Am I imagining this? In the beginning, I ran these questions consciously. I was aware I was running them. By the 6th year of our marriage, I ran them automatically, without awareness. The filter had become the baseline of my internal life, the constant low-level interrogation of my own perceptions that I performed so consistently I had stopped noticing I was performing it. I had become, by the 6th year of my marriage, a woman who did not trust what she saw clearly, a woman who had learned to doubt the most reliable instrument she possessed, and I had learned it from the man who was supposed to know her best. The dismissals had started small, so small that each individual one was dismissible itself, a comment about a design choice made lightly. Don't you think that's a bit much? Not aggressive, curious sounding, helpful sounding, the kind of comment that makes you look at the thing again and wonder if you missed something. A response to a business decision Claudette and I had made. I'm not sure that's the financially smartest move, but you know your business better than I do. That last sentence, you know your business better than I do, doing the specific work of installing doubt while technically expressing confidence. An observation about my emotional state after an argument. You always do this. You build things up in your head until they're bigger than they actually are. It's exhausting for both of us. Always. You always do this. The use of always is a specific technique. It takes a single moment and makes it a pattern. It takes a pattern and makes it a character flaw. It takes a character flaw and makes it a fixed truth about who you are. You always do this means this is not what happened today. This is who you are. I did not have language for this at the time. I have language for it now. By the 7th year, I had a habit I did not have a name for. Before I said anything about something I had noticed, I would pause. The pause was the filter activating. In the pause, I would run the questions, and usually, not always, but usually, I would decide that the thing I had noticed was not worth the conversation it would require, that the conversation would lead to Derek explaining why I had misread the situation, that I would come out of the conversation less certain of myself than I had gone into it, and I would let it go. Claudette noticed before I did. She said it to me once, carefully, the way she says hard things, which is directly but without performance. We were in the May & Co. office late on a Thursday evening, going over a project proposal for a new client, a restaurant renovation in downtown Franklin that was going to be the most complex project we had taken on. I made an observation about the client's aesthetic preferences, something subtle, something I had picked up from the way she spoke about her existing space during our consultation, not what she said, but how she said it, the specific hesitation before she described colors she didn't like that told me more about what she wanted than her actual answers had. Claudette looked at me when I finished. She said, "How do you always catch things like that? Things that aren't in what someone says?" I said, "I don't know, I just notice." She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her pen. Then she set it down again. She said, "I think you used to never second guess what you noticed. You would just say it, straight out, no hesitation. You've started running it through something before you say it, like you're checking whether it's allowed." I said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "I think you do." I didn't respond. She didn't push it, but she looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required, and I filed that look away in the place where I kept the things I wasn't ready to look at directly. That place was getting crowded. The counseling was Derek's idea, in the 8th year of our marriage, after a night I am going to tell you about in detail, because it is the night that cracked something in me, even though I did not act on that crack for another 8 months. Derek sat across from me at the dinner table on a Sunday evening in March and said he thought we needed help. He said it gently. He said it with the warmth he was capable of deploying when he needed it, the version of himself that had made me feel seen at a dinner party 13 years ago. He said, "I love you, and I think we've gotten lost somewhere. I think a professional could help us find our way back." I looked at my husband across the dinner table, and I felt two things simultaneously. The first was hope. The genuine, unguarded hope of a woman who still loved the marriage she was trying to hold together. The second was something quieter and less nameable than hope, a low note beneath the hope that I could not identify precisely, but that registered as, "Something about this is not what it sounds like." I ran the second feeling through the filter. I decided I was being too suspicious. I said yes. But before the counseling started, before that first Tuesday in Dr. Ellison's office, there was the night that shifted everything in me, even though I did not move for another 8 months. It was a Thursday in December. Derek had been in Memphis for 3 days for a regional sales conference. He came home on a Thursday evening with his suitcase and the particular tiredness of a man who has been traveling, a tiredness I had always found endearing, the way his shoulders dropped slightly when he came through the door and was finally allowed to be home. We had dinner. He told me about the conference, the sessions, the hotel, a colleague who had given a presentation Derek described as competent but uninspired. We talked for 40 minutes over food I had made and wine I had opened because I wanted the evening to feel like a return, like the warmth of a marriage coming home to itself. He went to bed early. I stayed up to finish a project proposal for the restaurant renovation. At 11:30, I went to the kitchen to make tea. Derek's jacket was over the kitchen chair. The habit that had driven me mildly crazy for 11 years, the jacket never making it to the closet, always ending up over the nearest chair like a question no one remembered asking. His phone was on the kitchen counter, face up, which he never did. Derek's phone was always face down. Always, from the beginning of the marriage, which I had taken as a quirk, a preference, a small privacy that everyone was entitled to. The phone being face up registered before I consciously noticed it. And then it lit up, a notification. I was not looking for anything. I was making tea. But the phone lit up and I was standing 2 feet from it and the notification appeared at the top of the screen and I saw, in the 3 seconds before the screen went dark, a name, Rena. Just that. No surname, no context, just a name in the notification banner above a message preview I was not close enough to read. The screen went dark. I stood at the kitchen counter. I looked at the dark screen. I made my tea. I went back to my proposal. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark beside Derek and I stared at the ceiling and I ran the name through the filter. Am I being too sensitive? It's a name, just a name. It could be anyone, a colleague, a client contact, a friend I don't know about. Am I imagining things? And for the first time in 7 years, the filter did not work.
Not because I had decided to stop running it, but because what I was trying to filter was not an absence, or a quality, or a feeling. It was a name, on a phone that was face up for the first time in 11 years, sent at 11:30 at night. And the filter had no explanation for the combination of those three specific things that left me less certain than I had been before. I lay in the dark and I did not sleep, and I did not decide anything. But something shifted in me that night, something quiet and permanent, like a bone that had been set wrong for years and had just imperceptibly, painlessly, moved 1 degree closer to where it was supposed to be. I would not feel the full correction for 8 more months, but it started that night. It started with a name I saw for 3 seconds on a kitchen counter at 11:30 on a Thursday in December. I need to tell you about Maya before I take you into Dr. Ellison's office, because Maya is the heart of this story, the part that lives underneath the betrayal and the financial conspiracy and the dinner and all the things that can be documented and presented and resolved. Maya cannot be documented. Maya can only be carried. Maya Grace May was born in the 6th year of our marriage, on a Tuesday morning in April. She arrived 6 weeks early, which the doctors had been monitoring and which we had been managing with the specific, controlled anxiety of parents who had been told something may be difficult, but who are also told there is every reason for hope. She was small, 4 pounds 11 ounces. She had Derek's coloring and my hands, the specific narrow shape of my hands that my mother had always called artist's hands. And she had a quality of presence from the first moment that I cannot describe scientifically, but that I felt physically when they placed her against my chest, like she had always been supposed to be there, like the room recognized her. She was in the NICU for her first 4 days. Derek and I spent every possible hour there. We sat on opposite sides of her incubator, and we looked at our daughter through the plastic, and we talked to her, quietly, the way you talk to someone sleeping, telling her about the house she was going to come home to, and the room we had painted for her, and the creek in the backyard she would be able to hear on quiet evenings. On day 5, they moved her to a regular room. On day 7, she came off the monitors. On day 9, the doctor told us she was progressing beautifully and that all indicators were positive. On day 10, Derek held her for the first time without all the equipment between them. I watched my husband hold our daughter, and I saw something in his face that I had not seen before and have not seen since. A quality of openness so complete, it looked like the removal of every layer he had spent his adult life building over whatever was most true about him. He looked like himself, the deepest version, and I thought, whatever else this life is, this is worth everything. Maya died on day 11, a complication that the doctors described as unforeseen and that I have spent 7 years working to hold without letting it become the only thing I feel when I think about her. She was 11 days old. Derek and I handled Maya's loss differently. This is not a criticism. Grief is not a performance that should be evaluated for correctness. People hold the things that break them in the ways they are able to hold them, and the ways they are able to hold them are shaped by everything that made them who they were long before the breaking happened. I went inward first and then outward. I found a grief counselor, a woman named Dr. Serena James, who worked out of Nashville and who had a specific understanding of perinatal loss that I needed in the first months. I cried. I talked about Maya constantly, to Claudette, to my mother, to Dr. James, to anyone who would stay in the room while I did it. I kept a photograph of her on my desk at May & Co., where I could see her every day and feel the full weight of her and the full love of her simultaneously, because I had learned early in my grief that the love and the loss were not separable, and that trying to feel one without the other was a form of forgetting her, and I refused to forget her. Derek went somewhere else, not away from me physically. He was there. He showed up. He went through the functional motions of the weeks after Maya with a steadiness that I interpreted at the time as strength. I understand now that it was not strength. It was foreclosure. Derek had closed a door inside himself the day Maya died, and he had locked it from the inside, and he had never, not once in 7 years since, unlocked it in front of me. I tried. In the first year after Maya, I tried many times to open the conversation, to bring her into the space between us, to say her name in a way that invited him to say it back. He would go still when I tried. Not angry, not cold, just still. Like a man waiting for a storm to pass that he had decided he would not go out into.
And eventually, not because I stopped grieving, not because I stopped needing, but because the stillness was so complete and so final, I stopped trying. I carried Maya alone, and Derek carried whatever he had locked behind that door alone. And we slept in the same bed for 7 years after that, and we were kind to each other in the functional ways of people who have agreed, without discussing it, to leave certain rooms of a house closed. And I believe, though I will never know for certain, that the locked door was part of what happened next, that a man who had locked his grief somewhere it could not be touched eventually found other things to lock away too, and that the habit of keeping things behind doors was easier to practice on a wife who had learned not to try those doors anymore. I do not say this to excuse him. I say it because it is the true shape of things, and the true shape matters even when it hurts. Dr. Patricia Ellison's office is on the second floor of a building on Main Street in Franklin. It has 2 chairs and a couch arranged in a triangle, a white noise machine outside the door that activates when a session begins, a single window that looks out onto the street below, the Franklin Street with the brick buildings and the coffee shops and the farmers market on Saturday mornings, a small table between the 2 chairs where people apparently put their phones. I liked Dr. Ellison immediately. She is in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that is warm without being soft, the specific professional warmth of someone who has learned that empathy and precision are not opposites and who practices both simultaneously. She asked us, in our first session, to describe the marriage in 3 words each. Derek said, loving, committed, struggling. I sat for a moment. I said, quiet, careful, distant. Dr. Ellison wrote both sets of words down without comment, but I noticed, because I notice everything, that her pen paused for a fraction of a second after she finished writing mine. Not long, not dramatically, just a fraction of a second where the pen stopped moving before she closed her notebook. I filed it. The sessions developed a rhythm over the first 2 months. We came every Tuesday, we sat in the 2 chairs, Dr. Ellison asked questions, and listened to the answers with the quality of attention that genuinely good therapists bring, the kind that hears not just what is said, but the shape of what is not said. Derek was a remarkable performer in those sessions. I want to be precise about this because I am aware that saying your husband performed in couples therapy sounds like the thing a woman says when she is bitter. I am not bitter, I am accurate. Derek in Dr. Ellison's office was warm and measured and genuinely seeming. He expressed real desire to understand where things had gone wrong. He validated the observations Dr. Ellison made. He used the vocabulary of therapy fluently and naturally. I hear what you're saying, and that makes sense, and I want to do better at that, in a way that I could not determine was either genuine facility or practiced performance. Both possibilities were disturbing in their different ways. And when the conversation turned toward my concerns, the distance, the quality of his absence, the dismissals, the way I had begun to feel over years like the difficult one in my own marriage, Derek would listen carefully, nod thoughtfully, and then explain. Sandra has always had a tendency to internalize things. What she's describing as distance is actually her own processing style affecting how she reads mine. I worry that Sandra looks for evidence of problems when things are going well. I think it comes from anxiety rather than from anything that's actually happening between us. Sandra is extraordinarily perceptive in her professional work. I think that perceptiveness sometimes turns inward in ways that aren't accurate. She reads meaning into things that are genuinely neutral.
each sentence technically a compliment, each sentence landing like a verdict. Dr. Ellison, who I want to be clear I do not blame for what happened in that room, would receive these statements with the measured consideration of someone working with the information she had been given. She would sometimes push back gently. She would ask Derek follow-up questions. She was not simply accepting everything he said, but she was also not seeing what I could see, which was a man who had spent 7 years constructing a case and was now presenting it in the most credible possible forum. I understand why she couldn't see it then. I barely saw it myself, and I was the one it was being done to. The fourth session, the one I need to tell you about precisely. We had been discussing a specific incident, a charge on our joint account from a restaurant in Memphis. I had asked Derek about it. He had told me it was a client dinner. I had asked which client. He had looked at me with an expression I had learned to recognize, patient, faintly tired, the expression of a man who has been asked a question he considers unreasonable, and said he did not have the client name memorized and could look it up for me if I really needed him to. I said I did not need him to. In Dr. Ellison's office, Derek used this as an example. He said, "This is the pattern I'm describing. She finds something small, something that has an ordinary explanation. She asks about it. I give her the explanation. She accepts it in the moment, and then 3 weeks later, something similar comes up, and I realize she never actually accepted it. She's been filing it, building something." Dr. Ellison asked if I wanted to respond. I said, "I think I just wanted to understand the account." Derek said, "I know you did, but the wanting to understand is sometimes the wanting to find something wrong, and that's exhausting for both of us." Dr. Ellison said, "Sandra, how do you respond to that?" I opened my mouth, and I felt the filter engage. Am I imagining things? Is he right? Is this anxiety? Is this me? And for a moment, a real moment, not a small one, I felt myself beginning to accept it, beginning to fold, beginning to do what I had been trained to do over 7 years, which was to receive the explanation and adjust my perception accordingly, and filed the whole thing under the category of Sandra's tendency to misread situations. And then Derek said, "I think Sandra sometimes imagines things that aren't there, and I think that's worth exploring professionally." And the folding stopped, not because of what he said, because of how he said it, because the word professionally landed in the room with a specificity that was different from the other sentences. Not, "I think Sandra misreads things," not, "I think Sandra has anxiety." I think this is worth exploring professionally. He wanted it in the record. That thought arrived in me with the cold, clean certainty of something I had been moving toward for a long time without knowing I was moving. He wanted Dr. Ellison's professional record to contain the observation that Sandra May sometimes imagines things. He knew yet what he intended to do with that record, but I knew, with the full, unfiltered force of a woman who had been noticing things clearly for 44 years, that the sentence had not been accidental. And then his phone lit up. The phone was on the small table between our chairs, face down, as always. When it lit up, the light came from beneath the phone and spread across the surface of the table in a warm glow that both of us saw simultaneously. I watched Derek's face, the blank, the specific 2-second blank of a man whose emergency calculation has activated.
Then, the controlled warmth returning like a mask sliding back into place. He reached for the phone, turned it over, glanced at the screen, said, "Sorry, work," turned it face down again. Dr. Ellison said, "Do you need to take that?" Derek said, "No, this is more important." He smiled. She smiled. I looked at my husband's face, and I understood, with the complete, final, unfiltered certainty of 44 years of noticing 2 things simultaneously. The name on that screen was Rena, and this man had been lying to me for a long time. Not in the way people lie when they are ashamed, in the way people lie when they have a plan. I did not react. I did not speak.
I looked at Dr. Ellison and I answered the question she had asked before the phone lit up, and I continued the session for its remaining 22 minutes with the composure of a woman who had just made a decision so quiet and so complete that the room could not feel it. The decision was this: I was going to stop filtering what I could see. I was going to look at everything, and then I was going to decide what I did with what I found. I drove home from Dr. Ellison's office that Tuesday evening alone. Derek had a client call. He would be back by 7. I parked in the driveway of the Franklin house, and I sat in the car for 8 minutes without going inside. I looked at the porch, the garden, the specific white of the exterior trim, and I thought about 11 years, and I thought about the blank face, and I thought about professionally. I got out of the car. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened the GPS app on my phone, the one synced to the family Tahoe, the one we had installed 3 years ago because Derek had said he wanted to be able to track Maya's routes when she started driving. When she started driving, Maya would have been 7. She would have been 7 years old and years away from driving. But we had installed the app anyway, because I had wanted the connection to her that the future was supposed to contain, even the small, ordinary futures like a teenager borrowing the car. I opened the app looking for a fuel receipt from the previous Thursday. I found the route to Memphis, and then I scrolled back 3 months, and I found 2214 Whittemore Lane 11 times. I looked at that address on the map for a long time. The coffee went cold beside me. The house was quiet, in the way houses are quiet when something inside them has just changed. I did not search the address that night. I closed the app. I started dinner. And when Derek came home at 7:14 and kissed me on the cheek and asked how the rest of my afternoon had been, I smiled and told him it had been productive, which was true, in every way that mattered. The 60 days that followed that Tuesday evening are the part of this story I find most difficult to tell, not because they were the most painful, though some of them were, but because they require me to describe a version of myself that I am still learning to fully understand, the version of myself that went quiet. Not the quiet of the previous 7 years, the managed quiet of a woman keeping the peace, a different quiet. The quiet of a woman who has decided that what she is building requires complete stillness on the surface, so that nothing underneath is disturbed before it is ready. For 60 days, I cooked dinner and went to Tuesday sessions and attended Gloria's Sunday lunches and slept in the same bed as Derek May. For 60 days, I smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and performed the version of Sandra that Derek had always believed he understood completely. And in the hours before he came home and after he left, and on the afternoons when the May & Co. office was quiet and Claudette was the only other person there, I looked at everything. The address first, 2214 Whittemore Lane, Nashville. I searched it on a Wednesday morning from the office, on the device I kept in Claudette's locked drawer, using the email account I had created specifically for this purpose on the day after the session. Residential, a condominium building, 4 stories, renovated 3 years ago, the kind of building that appears in lifestyle features under the heading Urban Living Reimagined. Clean lines, secure parking, the specific aesthetic of a building designed to attract young professionals with disposable income, and a preference for proximity to the city's better restaurants. I found no resident directory online. I did what I needed to do next. I drove to 2214 Whittemore Lane on a Thursday afternoon. I want to tell you about this drive, because I think it is important to be honest about what it felt like from the inside, not the cinematic version of a woman on a mission, but the true version, which was more complicated and more human than that. I felt sick for the first 20 minutes of the drive, not from fear, from grief, because I already knew, not the specific details, not the name, not the full architecture of the lie, but I already knew the essential truth that the address represented. I had known it since the night on the kitchen counter. I had known it since the blank face in Dr. Ellison's office. I had been running it through the filter for months, and the filter had been failing, and what was left when a filter fails is the thing that was always there. I drove to Nashville feeling the grief of knowing. The October wedding, the string quartet, the kitchen floor, Maya's hands, the narrow artist's hands that she had gotten from me that would never hold anything. I drove through all of that, and I kept going, because the grief did not change what I needed to do. It was just the price of doing it honestly. I parked across the street from 2214 Whittemore Lane at 2:15 p.m. The building was quieter than I expected at that hour. A weekday afternoon in a residential building, most residents at work, the building keeping its own company in the thin winter light. I sat in the car. I did not know exactly what I was waiting for. I was waiting for whatever would tell me something true. At 3:04, the front door of the building opened. A woman walked out. She was around 35, dark hair worn loose to her shoulders, professional clothes, the kind that suggested a job that required looking put together without being formal. She was carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and a coffee in her other hand, and she walked with the purposefulness of someone who always knew exactly where they were going and had decided exactly how fast to get there. She walked to a car in the visitor's space at the front of the building, a dark gray sedan. She got in, she drove away. I looked at the visitor space where the car had been. I had noted the make and the model and the partial plate number, and I had noted the laptop bag and the way she moved, and the specific way she had looked at her phone before getting into the car. A quick, habitual check, the kind you do when you are waiting for a message. I drove back to Franklin. 4 days. That is how long it took me to confirm her name. I am not going to tell you exactly how I did it because some of the specific methods belong to the private corners of a situation I was already doing my best to navigate with dignity. What I will tell you is that by the following Monday, I knew. Rena Castillo, 36 years old, marketing coordinator at a communications firm in Nashville that held a partnership contract with Derek's medical supply company. She had been at the company for 3 years, which meant Derek had known her for at least 3 years. The affair had been running, based on the location history, for 14 months, which meant that 14 months of my marriage had been occurring simultaneously with something else entirely. Our last anniversary, the restaurant in downtown Franklin, the wine Derek had chosen because he remembered it was my favorite, his hand across the table holding mine, was inside that 14 months. I sat at the office desk with that knowledge for a long time, the specific arithmetic of it, the dates, the overlaps. And then I put it in the folder and I kept going, because I was not done yet, not even close. The second phone. It was in the inside pocket of his winter coat, the heavy wool one he rarely wore in Tennessee's mild winters, a coat he had owned for 12 years that lived at the back of the hall closet and came out 3 or 4 times a season on the coldest mornings. I rotated the seasonal coats on a Saturday while Derek was at his gym, a habit I had maintained every November for as long as we had lived in the Franklin house, moving the heavier coats to the accessible section and the lighter ones to the back. I picked up the wool coat. I felt the weight of something in the inside pocket. I stood in the hall closet doorway for a moment. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it is paying attention. I carried the coat to the kitchen table. I sat down. I reached into the inside pocket. The phone was a basic model, not a smartphone, not a device you used for email or mapping or the 1,000 other things smartphones had made inevitable. A simple device with call and text capability, the kind of phone that exists specifically for communications you do not want recorded on a shared account. The kind of phone that costs $40 at a convenience store and can be activated with cash. I held it in my hand. I was not shaking. I want to be honest about that. I was not shaking, I was not crying, I was not having the reaction that I might have expected myself to have in a moment that confirmed in the most concrete possible terms what I already knew. What I felt was something very quiet and very still. like standing at the edge of something vast and finally being able to see clearly how far it extends. The phone was password protected. I could not access the contents. I did not need to. I photographed the phone. I photographed it in the coat pocket. I photographed the coat on the kitchen table with the pocket open. I put the phone back exactly as I had found it. I put the coat back in the hall closet exactly where I had found it. I returned every seasonal coat to its position in the order I had been moving them when I found it. Then I sat back down at the kitchen table, and I added the photographs to the folder. I need to tell you about the hardest part of those 60 days. Not the GPS address, not the second phone, not even what Claudette was about to show me. The hardest part was the Tuesday sessions, because I continued going. Every Tuesday at 4 o'clock, Derek and I drove to Dr. Ellison's office, sometimes together, sometimes in separate cars when one of us had a scheduling conflict, and we sat in the two chairs and we worked on our marriage. Or Derek worked on the record of our marriage, and I sat beside him and said true things about our relationship, things I genuinely felt, real concerns, honest attempts to articulate what had been lost between us. And I watched Derek receive them and translate them in real time into evidence for the case he was building. And I said nothing about what I was building. Not once. For 8 weeks of Tuesday sessions, I sat in the chair and I performed the version of Sandra that Derek had been curating for 2 years. The anxious one, the one who read into things, the one who needed professional help to understand the gap between her perceptions and reality. I performed it carefully because I understood, by the 5th week, with the full clarity of everything I had been finding, that the most valuable thing Derek was collecting in that office was Dr. Ellison's professional language describing Sandra's tendency to misread situations. He wanted that language. He wanted it documented. He wanted it signed with her credentials. And if I disrupted that process prematurely, if I showed any indication that I knew what was happening before I was ready, I would lose the 60 days I needed to build what I was building. So I sat in the chair, I said true things, I performed the filter, I let Dr. Ellison write her notes. And on the Tuesdays when I drove home alone, I would sit in the driveway of the Franklin house for exactly as long as I needed to, and I would feel everything I was not allowed to feel in that room. The grief, the anger, the specific aching exhaustion of performing your own diminishment for a professional audience. And then I would go inside and make dinner. This is what 60 days actually looks like. Not cinematic, not clean. Real. The Wednesday Claudette put the spreadsheet on the table was the 23rd day. She asked me to stay after the rest of the staff left. She closed the office door, she sat across from me at her desk with the printed spreadsheet between us, and she said, "I need you to let me get all the way through this before you respond. Can you do that?" I said, "Yes." She turned the spreadsheet toward me. 3 months ago, I found an anomaly in the May & Co. accounts, a loan inquiry that I did not initiate and that you had not told me about. I started looking into it. She let me look at the first page. In February of last year, someone used the May & Co. business registration and what appears to be your signature to apply for a business line of credit with First Southern Bank. The application was approved. The credit line is $180,000. It has been drawn against 4 times in the past 14 months. The current outstanding balance is $112,000. She paused. Your signature is on the application, but Sandra, I have seen your signature 10,000 times. That is not your signature. The office was quiet, the air cycling, the soft sound of the Franklin Street below the window. I said, "Who submitted the application?" Claudette looked at me for 1 moment. Then, "The contact information on the application is a phone number I don't recognize and an email address that isn't yours, but the application was submitted from an IP address I traced to the corporate network of Derek's company." The stone in my chest got heavier. I looked at the spreadsheet. $112,000. Drawn against my business. My name on a document I had never signed. My company used as collateral for a debt I did not know existed. I said, "How long have you known this?" She said, Known something was wrong? 3 months. Known it was Derek? 6 weeks. The room was very quiet. I said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" And Claudette, who is the most direct person I know and who almost never pauses before she answers, paused. She said, "Because 6 weeks ago you were still going to Tuesday sessions and talking about saving your marriage, and I didn't know how to hand you this while you were still holding that." I looked at my business partner. I said, "What made you decide to tell me now?" She said, "The session notes." I said, "What about them?" She said, "Last week I overheard you on the phone with the insurance company. They had a question about a claim, and you spent 5 minutes apologizing for having called with a question. 5 minutes apologizing for a phone call you were entitled to make." She looked at me steadily. "That's not you, Sandra. That's not who you were 3 years ago. And I think I've watched you get smaller for long enough that I don't care anymore whether the timing is right." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to secure this documentation somewhere only we can access, and I need you to not say anything to anyone." She nodded. "And, Sandra?" I looked up. "Whatever you're building, I'm with you, all the way through. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." I looked at Claudette Harris across the desk of the business we had built together, and for the first time in 23 days of 60, I felt something that was not grief and not cold clarity and not the managed stillness of a woman keeping everything contained. I felt accompanied, and that mattered more than I have words for. The Pamela discovery. I need to tell you about this carefully because Pamela is the most complicated piece of this story, more complicated than Derek in some ways, because Derek's betrayal was the betrayal of a husband, which is a specific and categorized kind of pain that people have language for. What Pamela did does not have the same ready language, because what Pamela did was done inside a friendship. Pamela May is 3 years older than Derek. She is 50 years old, lives in Brentwood, works in pharmaceutical sales, and has occupied a specific role in my life for 11 years that I would have described before the 38th day of my 60 as complicated but warm. Not close, not the kind of closeness that requires vulnerability or deep trust, but warm, genuinely warm, I had believed. We had lunch occasionally. She had come to me for design advice when she renovated her home office 2 years ago. She called me on my birthday without fail. She sat across from me at every family gathering and called me her sister with the specific warmth of a woman who meant it in the way that family gatherings make people mean things, fully in the moment, if not always fully in the day after. I had trusted her with small things, the way you trust the people in your orbit who feel safe enough to share with. A concern about Derek's emotional distance, mentioned over lunch 18 months ago when Pamela had asked directly how things were at home, and I had answered more honestly than I intended to because it was a Tuesday and I was tired, and she had asked with a quality of attention that felt like genuine care. A worry about the business, referenced briefly in a phone call 6 months ago when she had asked how May & Co. was doing, and I had said something vague about the pressure of managing growth. A specific argument Derek and I had in February that I had described, in outline not in detail, when Pamela called 2 days after it and asked how I was doing. She had always called after the difficult weeks. I understand now why the timing was so consistent. I found the email thread on the 38th day. I had been going through Derek's work email, which I had access to because we had shared the password years ago for logistical reasons he had never thought to revise. The thread was between Derek and Pamela. It went back 11 months. I read it at the May & Co. office on a Tuesday evening after everyone else had gone home. I read it twice, because the first time through I needed to read it as information. The second time through I allowed myself to read it as what it was. Pamela's first message in the thread was sent the same day as our lunch 18 months ago, the lunch where I had answered her question about my marriage more honestly than I intended to, because it was a Tuesday and I was tired, and she had asked with a quality of attention that felt like genuine care. A surprise was sent from Derek 3 days later, a wordless text that read, "I need more details." The thread continued from there. Derek's responses were brief and directive. Tell me more about the business worry. How specific was she? And Pamela's responses were detailed and precise, the detail of someone who had been asking careful questions and listening carefully to the answers with the specific purpose of reporting accurately. There was a message from Pamela in April describing the February argument, details I had shared briefly in a phone call, reported to Derek within 24 hours. There was a message from Derek that read, "Good, keep asking about the financials. I need the full picture before I file." Before I file. There it was again. Before I file. I looked at that sentence for a long time. And then I looked at the full thread, 11 months of it, and I understood what I was reading. A surveillance system, built inside a friendship, running for at least 11 months, possibly longer. I sat in the office after dark and I held the phone, and I felt the specific grief of a betrayal that has no clean category. Not the betrayal of a husband, not the betrayal of an enemy, but the betrayal of someone who sat across from me at lunch and asked how I was doing with warmth in her eyes and a purpose in her pocket. And then I added the screenshots to the folder, and I kept going. The discovery that changed the architecture of everything. I need to tell you about this slowly, because it is the piece of this story that took me the longest to fully hold. On the 44th day, I found something I was not looking for. I had been going through Derek's deleted emails, a folder I had been working through methodically for 2 weeks, when I found a forwarded message. It was forwarded from Derek to his personal account, originally sent to Derek by a contact identified only as R. Marsh, with a note, "Thought you should see this. Could be relevant to your situation." The attachment was a document.
A letter from Gerald Hatch. Gerald Hatch is a family law attorney in Franklin with an office on Fifth Avenue and a reputation in the legal community as someone who specialized in high-asset divorce cases and who was known, among the attorneys Catherine Oakes would later describe to me, for a particular strategy: the strategy of filing first. The letter from Gerald Hatch to Derek was dated 4 months ago. It outlined, in the specific clinical language of legal strategy, a plan. The plan involved 3 elements. First, the establishment of a documented record of the opposing party's emotional instability, citing the marriage counseling sessions as the primary vehicle for this documentation. Second, the positioning of May & Co. as a marital asset subject to division on the grounds that the business had grown significantly during the marriage and that Derek's income had provided the financial stability enabling that growth. Third, the filing of divorce proceedings before Sandra became aware of the strategy in order to control the narrative and the initial legal framing. The letter used a specific phrase that I read 4 times. The opposing party's documented pattern of anxiety and misattribution of neutral events, as established through the therapeutic record, will significantly strengthen our position in asset division proceedings. The therapeutic record. Dr. Ellison's notes. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. The counseling was not a genuine attempt to save the marriage. The counseling was the collection of evidence. I sat at the office desk in the dark with that letter on the screen in front of me, and I felt something move through me that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite the cold, clear, settled thing I had been operating from for 6 weeks. It was something older and more complete than any of those things. It was the feeling of a woman who has spent 11 years being told she imagines things, finally, completely, and without any remaining doubt, understanding that she did not imagine a single thing. Not one. The pause before answers, the dismissals, the filter, the counseling, the professionally. All of it connected, all of it intentional, all of it pointed toward a specific outcome that Derek had been engineering while I cooked dinner and tended the garden and sat in the 2 chairs and tried to explain what was wrong with our marriage. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for exactly as long as I needed to, and then I picked up my phone, and I called Claudette. She answered on the 2nd ring. I said 5 words. "I need Catherine Oakes's number." Claudette said, "Sending it now." She did not ask a single question. She already knew. Catherine Oakes has an office in Brentwood, Tennessee,
30 minutes from Franklin, one county removed from the courthouse where Gerald Hatch filed the majority of his cases. Claudette had used Catherine in her own divorce 14 years ago and had described her to me once, before any of this, as the kind of woman who already knows where the bodies are before you sit down. She just needs you to confirm the location. I met her on a Monday morning in the 7th week of my 60 days. She is in her early 60s, with gray hair worn simply, reading glasses on a chain, and the manner of someone who has done this specific work for long enough that nothing surprises her and everything is taken seriously regardless. She had already reviewed everything I sent her before I arrived. She looked at me over her glasses when I sat down and said, "You've built an exceptional case." I said, I had 60 days and a clear reason to pay attention. This time she did smile. Then she put the glasses back on and told me what we were going to do. First, the business protection. Catherine connected me with a forensic accountant named David Park, who specialized in business asset disputes in divorce proceedings. He was 53 years old, soft-spoken, and had the specific quality of a man who had looked at fraudulent financial documentation so many times that he could identify it by its texture before he had read the detail. He spent 5 days going through the May & Co. accounts with Claudette. His report was 62 pages. It established 3 things with complete legal clarity. 1. The fraudulent loan, the forged signature, the IP address tracing to Derek's corporate network, the $112,000 outstanding balance, documented, certified, supported by bank records obtained through Catherine's office under a preservation order. 2. The complete financial history of May & Co. over 12 years, every client, every revenue stream, every operational decision, establishing beyond any legal ambiguity that the business had been built entirely through Sandra's professional work, professional relationships, and professional judgment, with zero financial contribution from Derek at any point in its 12-year history. Third, the formal current valuation of May & Co. as a business asset. I read all 62 pages, every paragraph, not because Catherine needed me to, because it was mine. Every page of it was mine, and I wanted to know exactly what I had built. Second, the marital finances. I spent 3 evenings going through our joint financial history with the methodical attention I usually reserved for project specifications. What I found, and what David Park subsequently confirmed, was a pattern. Small transfers, monthly, from the joint account to a personal account in Derek's name only. Not dramatic amounts, the kind of amounts that could be dismissed individually as unremarkable, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, occasionally more. Over 22 months, the total was $43,000, moved quietly, the way you move things when you are building a position and do not want anyone to notice until the position is established. David Park documented all of it. Third, Gerald Hatch. Catherine made a single call to the Tennessee State Bar. Gerald Hatch opened a file in Derek's name 4 months ago. Confirmed. Catherine pulled Hatch's recent case history. She had opposed him on court 6 times. She had won 5. I asked about the one she lost.
She said, "Learning experience." I said, "What did you learn?" She said, "To never underestimate how thoroughly a man who believes he has already won can miscalculate." I said, "Derek believes he has already won." She looked at me over her glasses. She said, "I know." She went back to her notes. "That's why I'm not worried." Fourth, the second phone records. Catherine's office, through legal channels I will not detail here, established that the number registered to Derek's second phone had been in contact with a specific set of other numbers over the preceding 14 months. Rena Castillo's personal cell, confirmed. Gerald Hatch's office line, confirmed. And a third number, a number that I stared at for a long time when Catherine showed it to me. Dr. Patricia Ellison's administrative line. 3 calls, over 6 months, from Derek's second phone, the phone he used for the communications he did not want documented on a shared account. 3 calls to the administrative line of our marriage counselor. I sat with that for a full day before I could fully process what it might mean. I do not know what was said in those calls. I do not know if Dr. Ellison was aware of who she was speaking with, or whether the communications were innocent and administrative.
What I do know is that the number was there, in the call log of a phone whose entire purpose was to conduct the undocumented life. And that knowledge, sitting with that knowledge, completed something in my understanding. This had not been a marriage that failed. This had been a dismantling, sustained, patient, executed with the specific calm of someone who had decided that the most efficient way to take something from a person was to make them doubt it was ever theirs. Fifth, Pamela. Catherine advised me on the legal elements of what Pamela had done. The email thread was admissible documentation of coordinated conduct that could be relevant in establishing the pattern of bad faith across the proceedings. But I spent more time thinking about Pamela than about any other element of what I was building. Not because I was uncertain about what she had done, because I was deciding what I wanted the room to do with it. Catherine wanted me to present the emails directly, to read them, to place them on record clearly and completely. I thought about that, and then I thought about the way people behave when they are cornered. Pamela cornered would become defensive. She would redirect. She would produce a version of events that reframed her conduct as concern for her brother, and some people in that room, people who knew Pamela and loved her, might receive that version with enough sympathy to dilute the impact. Pamela not cornered, Pamela believing she was safe, believing the ground was still solid, would do what people who have been performing safety for a long time always do when the ground shifts. She would say the wrong thing, at exactly the wrong moment, in front of exactly the wrong people. I did not need to corner her. I just needed to shift the ground and let her corner herself. The night before Gloria's birthday dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with Claudette. Derek was in Nashville. The folder was complete. Catherine had everything. Marcus Webb, the process server, had his instructions and his timeline, and confirmation of the 8:45 entry. The 62-page document was in my bag in a sealed envelope. Claudette and I sat at the kitchen table with tea and the specific quiet of a house that knew something was about to change. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "How are you?" Not "how is the plan?" "How are you?" I let that question land the way she meant it. I said, "I've been thinking about Maya." She waited. I said, "I keep thinking about the fact that we installed that GPS app because Derek said he wanted to be able to track her routes when she was old enough to drive. She would have been 7 years old this year." Claudette said nothing. 7 years old, I said. Years away from driving, and we installed an app for it, because I wanted the future. I wanted all the ordinary futures she was supposed to have, the learning to drive one, the borrowing the car one, all of them. I stopped, and I found everything because I was looking for a fuel receipt in an app I had installed for a future that didn't happen. The kitchen was very quiet. Claudette reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. We sat like that until the tea went cold. Then she said, "Are you ready?" I looked at my oldest friend. I said, "I've been ready for 7 years. I just didn't know what I was ready for." She squeezed my hand. We went over the plan one more time. Then she drove home, and I went to bed. And I slept, completely, deeply, without waking, for the first time in 8 months. Gloria May's 71st birthday dinner was held on a Saturday evening in November at a restaurant called The Homestead in Brentwood. Private dining room in the back, white tablecloths, a fireplace along one wall where the early arrivals were gathering with their drinks and their particular performance of a family that was doing well. 40 guests. Family, Derek's father, Harold's former colleagues from the agricultural cooperative where he had worked for 30 years, women from Gloria's church who had known her since before her children were born, neighbors from the Brentwood street where Derek and Pamela had grown up who could tell you stories about both of them as children that the children themselves had carefully curated out of their adult presentations. People who believed they knew the May family. People who were about to learn the shape of the thing they thought they knew. I dressed carefully, a dark navy dress I had bought for a client presentation 18 months ago, the kind of dress that communicated exactly one thing, clearly, a professional woman in complete possession of herself. I did my makeup at the kitchen table with the specific care of someone who understands that the way you present yourself in the moments that matter is not vanity, it is intention. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror before I left. I looked at Sandra May, the woman who noticed everything for 44 years, the woman who had spent 7 years running those notices through a filter that told her she was wrong. The woman who had spent 60 days looking at everything she had been told she was imagining and finding all of it and more, and then building something with what she found that Derek could not have anticipated because he had spent 11 years convincing himself that she was not capable of it. I picked up my bag. I walked out of the Franklin house. Claudette drove me. She was not on the guest list. She parked on Elm Street 2 blocks from the homestead, and she would be there when I came out. Marcus Webb was in the parking lot with his paperwork. 8:45 was his instruction. I walked into the homestead at 7:12 p.m. The room was warm and full in the way of gatherings that believed themselves to be celebrations.
The fireplace, the white tablecloths, the particular ambient sound of 40 people in a pleasant room performing their best versions of themselves. I recognized most of the faces, and I understood, walking through the door of that room into the warmth of it, that these people had been told a version of Sandra May by a family that had spent years constructing it. The anxious one, the difficult one, the one who read into things. They were about to meet a different version, the real one. Gloria saw me first. She was near the fireplace in the burgundy dress she had mentioned buying specifically for tonight. She is a small woman with Derek's coloring and the specific assurance of someone who has spent 71 years being the center of her rooms. When she saw me, her face arranged itself into welcome, genuine welcome. Gloria had never disliked me. She had simply decided, somewhere in the first year of my marriage to her son, that I was less than the sum of my parts, and had spent 11 years expressing that conclusion through the specific language of almost compliments. She opened her arms. I walked into them. I said, "Happy birthday, Gloria. You look beautiful." She said, "Sandra, I'm so glad you made it." And I thought, you have no idea. Derek found me within 4 minutes. He was in the public version of himself, warm, attentive, his hand finding the small of my back in the gesture that read to the room as affection, and that I felt as the specific pressure of a man managing something he believed he still controlled. He said, "You look great. Good day?" I said, "Very productive." He smiled, I smiled, and I found my seat. The evening moved through its phases. Drinks, the gathering of more guests, the warm accumulation of a party finding its rhythm. I watched everything. The way Derek worked the room, table to table, the handshakes and the laughter. The man who made everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room. The way Pamela tracked the evening's energy from her position near the bar, waiting for the moment of maximum warmth, the moment when an announcement would land with the greatest impact. The way Harold moved along the perimeter, pleasant to everyone, present for no one, the gentle man who had spent his life avoiding the weight of things and was about to find that the weight had been accumulating in his absence. And Gloria. I watched Gloria because Gloria was the one I had thought about the most. Not Derek, not Pamela, Gloria. The woman who had spent 11 years deciding I was less than I was, and who was going to spend this evening understanding the cost of that decision. At 7:45, Derek gave his toast to his mother. It was beautifully constructed, a story from his childhood that made the room laugh at exactly the right moment, a reflection on what Gloria had given him that felt genuine because some of it was genuine. This is the specific difficulty of a man who is capable of real warmth and has chosen to deploy it selectively. The warmth is real, the selection is the problem. He raised his glass. He said, "To the woman who taught me what it means to love your family completely." 40 people raised their glasses. I raised mine. I sipped, and I thought, 30 minutes.
At 8:15, Pamela stepped up. She had been building to this moment all evening. I could see it in the way she had been managing her position in the room, strategic, patient, the same family gift for attention that Derek had, applied with Pamela's specific additional quality, which was a competitive edge that she had spent her adult life presenting as love. She opened her arms. I walked into them. I said, "Happy birthday, Gloria. You look beautiful." She said, "Sandra, I'm so glad you made it." And I thought, you have no idea. To Derek and to the people who stand by him. Not to Derek and Sandra, not to this marriage, to the people who stand by him. I heard it. Barbara Jenkins, who was sitting at a table to my left, a church friend of Gloria's, 70 years old, sharp as a tack and without patience for imprecision, heard it too. I caught her eye across the room. She looked from Pamela to me. Something moved in her expression. She looked back at her wine.
At 8:32, Harold appeared beside me at the drinks table. He said, "Sandra, how are you doing? Really?" I said, "I'm doing well, Harold." He said, "You seem settled tonight, more than usual." I looked at this gentleman who had spent 30 years on the perimeter of his family's center. I said, "I am settled, more than usual." He patted my hand. He started to move away. Then he stopped. He turned back. He said, "Whatever happens tonight, for what it's worth, I have always thought you were exactly the right person for my son. I have always thought that." He moved back toward the perimeter. I stood at the drinks table and held that sentence for a moment. And then I checked my watch. 8:32. 13 minutes. At 8:38, Pamela sat beside me. The gathering had softened into the post-dinner phase. Small conversations, the specific warmth of a room that has eaten well and drunk enough and settled into the pleasure of its own company. Derek was across the room. Pamela came with her wineglass and her warm performance and sat beside me as though we were simply two women at a family party finding a quiet moment. She said, "You okay? You've been quiet." I said, "I've been thinking." She said, "About what?" I said, "About how much I've shared with you over the years, things I didn't share with many other people." Something moved behind her eyes. Fast, gone immediately. She said, "Of course, that's what family is for." I thought so too. A pause, the room humming around us. She said, "Sandra." And then Marcus Webb walked into the private dining room of the homestead at 8:43 p.m. He was dressed business casual. He carried a leather portfolio. He walked directly to Derek with the specific purpose of a man who had done this enough times to know that directness was the only appropriate manner. The room did not notice immediately, but I was watching Derek's face, and I saw the moment, the blank, the 2-second emergency calculation, the controlled return of the mask. Marcus Webb spoke to Derek in a low voice. Derek responded. Marcus Webb opened the portfolio, and then, loudly enough for the tables nearest them to hear, because by this point the room had the particular collective attention of 40 people who had noticed that something was happening, Marcus Webb said, "Mr. May, you have been formally served." The room went still. The way rooms go still when 40 people simultaneously decide to stop performing and start paying attention. Gloria said, "What?" Harold turned from the perimeter. Pamela went rigid beside me. Derek held the document and said, "It's fine. It's nothing. Let's..." But the room had heard "formally served," and 40 people who knew the May family were looking at Derek May holding legal papers at his mother's birthday dinner. And then they were looking at me. I stood up, the way I stand up at the end of a presentation when the work is complete. Not dramatically, not for effect, just standing. The room went quieter. I said, "I'm sorry to interrupt the evening. I want to be honest about what just happened, because I think you all deserve honesty." Derek said, "Sandra, not here." I looked at my husband.
the man who had cried on a kitchen floor, the man who had held my hand through 11 days that were the worst and the most love I had ever experienced simultaneously, the man who had spent 7 years telling me I was imagining things he knew were real. I said, "Derek, I've been not here for 7 years. I'm going to be here now." I turned to the room. I did not make a speech. I want you to understand that clearly. What I did was answer questions honestly for the first time in 11 years. I said, "Several weeks ago, I found an address in our family car's GPS history that my husband had visited 11 times over 4 months without ever mentioning it. I spent 60 days finding out what that address meant." I placed David Park's 62-page document on the table. What it meant was not only an affair, it was a loan taken against my business using a forged signature. It was a divorce filing my husband began 4 months ago without telling me. And it was a deliberate strategy to use our marriage counseling sessions to establish a professional record describing me as emotionally unstable in preparation for divorce proceedings in which my business was to be positioned as a marital asset. The room was entirely still, absolutely still. The fire, the candle flames bending in the draft from the kitchen, Gloria's hand on the table, Derek, the document in his hands, his face doing calculations it had never needed to run in a room this size, in front of people it had always successfully performed for. Gloria said, "Derek, what is she talking about?" Derek said, "Mom, this is a misunderstanding. I have been paying attention for 60 days, after 11 years of being told that paying attention was a character flaw." Pamela stood up. I had been waiting. She said, "Sandra, I understand you're upset, but making these kinds of accusations in public, in front of the family, this isn't—" Barbara Jenkins set her wineglass down. She said, "Pamela." Pamela looked at her. Barbara said, "You just gave a toast to the people who stand by him, in front of his wife, at a family dinner. So if you're going to talk about what's appropriate, let's start there." The room shifted. 40 people rearranging what they thought they knew about what kind of evening this was. And Pamela, who had been performing for 11 months, who had been safe inside a strategy that depended entirely on Sandra never knowing and the room never seeing, felt the ground shift, and she said the thing I had been waiting for her to say. Not because I had trapped her, because people who have been performing for a long time cannot sustain the performance when the stage is pulled out from under them.
She said, "I was just trying to support my brother. I've known about his concerns for over a year. I was trying to help him protect himself." The room heard every word. "I've known for over a year?" Harold turned from the perimeter. He looked at his daughter. He said, "Known what, Pamela? For a year?" She said, "Dad, Derek was—" He said, "For a year, you knew something was wrong in their marriage. You knew your brother was planning something, and you said nothing. To your mother, to me, to Sandra." His voice was entirely quiet, not angry, something beyond anger. The specific stillness of a gentle man who has spent his whole life avoiding the weight of things and has just finally, in a restaurant in Brentwood on a Saturday evening, decided to stop. He said, "What did you do, Pamela?" And Pamela, for the first time in the 11 years I had known her, had no answer. Gloria spoke. She had been sitting in her chair through all of this, with her hands flat on the white tablecloth, and her face doing something I had never seen Gloria's face do, going inward. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at Derek. She looked at her daughter. And then she looked at me, and she said, quietly, just to me, just for me, "Sandra, I didn't know." 2 seconds, and then, "I am sorry for what I didn't see." I said, "I know you didn't, Gloria." She nodded, and then she looked at her son,
and the look on her face in that moment was the thing that broke the room open more than any document or any revelation, because it was the look of a woman who has loved her child her entire life and who is sitting at her own birthday dinner, understanding fully and finally the cost of loving without accountability. It was not anger, it was grief, real grief, the kind that knows it is too late for the specific thing it is grieving for. She looked at Derek and she said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence said everything his had never said. Derek made one more attempt. He said, "Sandra, whatever you think you found, there is context you don't have. There is a version of all of this that is more complicated than—" I said, "Derek." He stopped. I said, "I have 62 pages of documentation prepared by a forensic accountant. I have the GPS history. I have the second phone records. I have the emails between you and Pamela. I have the Gerald Hatch letter from 4 months ago." I paused. "I have everything." The room was completely quiet. I said, "There is no context." Derek looked at the document in his hands. He looked at the room. He looked at his father's face. He looked at his mother. And then he stopped looking. He just stood there holding the papers and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. The man who had spent 11 years telling me I was imagining things, standing in a room full of witnesses, holding the proof of everything I had ever seen clearly. I picked up my bag. I said, "Happy birthday, Gloria," and I walked toward the door. I passed Barbara Jenkins' table. She did not stand. She did not perform anything. She said, "You handled that with more grace than they deserved." I touched her shoulder briefly. I kept walking. I passed Harold near the door. He stepped forward. He said, "Sandra." I stopped. He said, "I'm sorry. For all the years I stood on the perimeter and let things happen that I should have looked at more carefully." I looked at Harold May. "Thank you, Harold." I walked out. The November air was cold and still. The parking lot of the homestead was empty, except for the neat rows of cars and the yellow light spilling from the restaurant windows, and the sound, faint behind me, of 40 people inside a private dining room processing what they had just witnessed. Claudette's car was on Elm Street. I walked 2 blocks. I got in the passenger seat. She looked at my face. She said, "Done?" I said, "Done." She started the engine. We drove back to Franklin in the dark and quiet of a Tennessee November night that asked nothing of anyone passing through it. At some point, Claudette said, "How do you feel?" I thought about that for a moment. The full, honest answer. I said, "Like I've been carrying something for 11 years that I put down about 40 minutes ago, and my arms don't know what to do yet." She said, "They'll figure it out." I said, "I know." We drove the rest of the way without talking, and the quiet, for the first time in a very long time, had no weight in it. I want to tell you about the months after the dinner, not because the story needs a tidy resolution, because I think you deserve the honest version of what comes after the moment, the real, complicated, imperfect version that does not resolve cleanly or quickly into something that looks like peace. Real peace is not quick. Real peace is something you build, one decision at a time, in the direction of the life you know you deserve, over a period that is longer and less linear than any story can fully capture. Derek moved out of the Franklin house within the week, not voluntarily. Catherine Oakes filed for a temporary exclusive occupancy order on Monday morning based on the fraudulent loan documentation and the evidence of financial misconduct. The judge granted it within 48 hours. I was in the May & Co. office when Catherine called to tell me. I sat at my desk for a moment after I hung up. Then I called Claudette into my office. I said, "The order was granted." She sat down. She said, "Good." We looked at each other across the desk. Then she said, "How do you feel?"
I said, "Tired. Like I have been running for a very long time and I have just been allowed to stop." She nodded. She stood up. She went back to her office.
And I sat at my desk and I looked at the photograph of Maya that had been there for 7 years. I said out loud to the photograph in the empty office, "I did it, baby." And I let myself cry for the first time in 60 days. A long time. Gerald Hatch filed a countermotion challenging the occupancy order and citing the therapeutic record as evidence of instability. Catherine's response was 41 pages long. It included the forensic accountant's documentation, the forged signature evidence, the $43,000 in marital fund transfers, the second phone records, the Gerald Hatch letter from 4 months ago, and a formal complaint to the Tennessee State Bar regarding the use of a therapeutic record obtained through a coordinated pattern of documented bad faith. Gerald Hatch withdrew the countermotion within 10 days. He cited scheduling conflicts. Catherine did not comment publicly on that decision. She sent me a one-line email. As expected. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. I am not going to give you the full legal detail of those 8 months, because they are the least interesting part of this story, the formal, procedural, documented processing of an outcome that had already been decided in the room. At the end of those 8 months, Sandra May retained full ownership of the Franklin house, full ownership of May & Co., full restitution for the fraudulent loan, including penalties, a settlement that reflected the documented financial misconduct and that Catherine described, without visible emotion, as appropriate. Gerald retained his career and his personal accounts. He relocated to Nashville within 3 months of the divorce being finalized. I do not know what his life looks like now. I genuinely do not think about it. What he does with the person he is, that is his to figure out. I am occupied with the person I am. Pamela called once, 6 weeks after the dinner. A voicemail, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know the length because I checked before I listened. It was a genuine apology in some places and a self-protective explanation in others, and it had the particular quality of a message composed by someone who needed to say it for their own reasons as much as for the person receiving it. I listened to it once. I sent a text. "Pamela, I believe some of what you said is true. I also believe you know exactly what you did. I need space right now. I wish you well." She did not respond. 3 months later, she sent a card. No message inside, just a card with a single line. "I should have been a better sister-in-law to you. I'm sorry, Sandra." I put it in a drawer. I did not throw it away. I also did not put it on the refrigerator. There are different categories of honesty, and I am learning to hold them without collapsing them into each other. Harold called 3 times. The first call was an apology. Simple, clean, without qualification. He said, "What Derek did was wrong. What Pamela did was wrong. I spent 30 years on the perimeter of my own family, and things happened in my absence that I should have seen. I'm sorry." I said, "Thank you, Harold." The second call was to ask if I needed anything. I told him I had everything I needed. The third call came on the day the divorce was finalized. He said, "I know today is hard. I just wanted you to know I was thinking about you." I said, "That means more than you know." I meant it. Harold May was not a man who protected me when he should have, but he was a man who, when the ground shifted, stood on the right side of it without being asked. That matters. People who get things wrong and then do the right thing afterward without being compelled to, that matters in a different way than people who get everything right from the beginning. It does not erase the wrong, but it is real, and real things deserve to be held accurately. Gloria. I received a card in the mail 8 weeks after the dinner. No letter, just a card with a handwritten note on the inside. "Sandra, I am sorry for what my son did, and I am sorry for 11 years of deciding you were less than you were. I know an apology is insufficient. I don't know what sufficient looks like, but I wanted you to have it, not because I expect anything from you in return, just because you deserve to hear it. Gloria." I read it twice. I put it on the refrigerator, next to Maya's photograph, because Gloria's apology and Maya's photograph belong together in a specific way that I am still finding language for. Both of them represent things I cannot have back. Both of them represent things that were real. And both of them, held together, on the refrigerator in the kitchen I designed myself, are part of the honest landscape of a life that is mine. All of it. The grief, and the love, and the loss, and the building, and the document, and the dinner, and the November parking lot, and the drive home in the dark. All of it mine. Dr. Patricia Ellison. I requested a meeting with her 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Not for legal purposes, not to make accusations. I had no interest in any action against Ellison. I went because I needed to say something to the person who had been in the room. I sat across from her in the office with the white noise machine outside the door. I told her what I had found, the relevant pieces. She listened without interrupting. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "I'm not sure you do. You worked with the information you were given." She said, "That's the problem. I worked with his information. He came prepared. He came with vocabulary and a narrative and a consistency that I should have worked harder to see around it." She looked at her hands. She said, "There were things you said in session that I received as symptoms of what he was describing. Things that I now understand were you accurately describing what was being done to you, and I treated your accuracy as evidence of your instability." She looked up. "That is not a mistake I will make again." I said, "I believe you, and I think you're a good therapist, Dr. Ellison." She said, "I think I had a significant learning experience with this case." We talked for another hour. It was the most honest conversation I had since Claudette put the spreadsheet on the table. I left that office feeling something unexpected, not vindicated, seen, by the person who had been in the room when the lie was performed most clearly, and who had the integrity to sit across from me and say she had heard it wrong. I found a new therapist for the individual work, a woman named Dr. Jess Okafor, who practiced in Nashville and had a particular gift for sitting beside grief without hurrying it towards somewhere it wasn't ready to go. I went every week for 14 months. I talked about the marriage, about the filter, about the 7 years of running my own clearest perceptions through a mechanism designed to make them disappear, about Maya, about the locked door and what it meant for both of us, about the night on the kitchen counter with the cold coffee and the 3 seconds of a name on a screen that had started in me that would take 60 days and an entire architecture to complete. I talked about the woman I had been before I started asking myself whether I was imagining things.
And I found my way back to her. Not all at once, not linearly, the way you find your way back to something real, through the work of returning to it day after day, until one morning you wake up and you are simply there. Maeve & Co. Maeve & Co. is still standing. I need to say that simply and clearly because I think it is the most important sentence in the aftermath of this story. The business Derek tried to use as a position in a financial strategy, the business he forged a signature to claim a piece of, is still here, still mine, still growing. Priya is now a full partner. James leads operations. Theo runs a design team of 3. Claudette manages the business side with the same precision and loyalty she has always brought to it, and with the specific additional quality that comes from a woman who stood with her business partner through the hardest 60 days either of them had experienced, and came out the other side still standing. We took on a project last spring, the renovation of a community arts center in East Nashville, that was the most complex and the most meaningful work I have done in 12 years. A space that had been neglected for a decade, a building that had served the community for 40 years and that had been slowly closing in on itself, getting smaller and darker, its rooms no longer feeling like the rooms they were supposed to be. I spent 3 months on it. Every decision, every sample, every conversation with the client about what the space was supposed to feel like when people were inside it. Not just how it would look, but what it would do to the people who walked through its doors. What a space should do. Make people feel like they are exactly where they are supposed to be.
I stood in the finished center on the day we completed it. The light was right. The proportion was right. The specific quality of the space, open, warm, exactly itself, was right in the way that the best rooms are right. And I thought about the filter, about the years of running my clearest perceptions through a mechanism designed to make them disappear, about what it had cost, about what was still here. The Franklin house. I kept it. Some people told me to sell, to let the space go along with everything it had held. I walked through every room. I stood in the kitchen with the specific white on the walls that had taken 11 samples. I walked to the garden I had planted 9 springs ago. I stood on the wraparound porch in the November cold, and I looked at the Franklin Street below, and I listened to the creek in the backyard that I could hear when everything was quiet. And I understood, the way I understand spaces, that this house was not the marriage. This house was mine. I had built it. I had tended it. I had designed every room in it toward what those rooms were supposed to be. I was not going to give it to what had happened inside it. I stayed. I repainted the bedroom, a color I had always wanted and that Derek had called impractical. Deep blue, the specific shade of blue that exists in the sky about 20 minutes before full dark. Not night yet, not day anymore. That threshold color that is both and neither simultaneously. It is exactly right. It took me 3 samples to find it, which for me was practically immediate. There is one more thing I need to tell you. About Maya. About what happened one ordinary morning 4 months after the divorce was finalized, when I was standing in the kitchen at 7 a.m. making coffee, looking at the photograph of her on the refrigerator next to Gloria's card. I was looking at her narrow hands, the artist's hands she had gotten from me, and I was thinking, the way I had been trying to think about her for 7 years, through the locked door Derek had put between us and her name, through the filter that had made everything, including my own grief, feel like something to be managed rather than held. I was just thinking about her, without the filter, without the management, just Maya. 11 days, 5 pounds, 2 ounces, artist's hands. The dogwood trees outside the hospital window, the future she was supposed to have, all of it, every ordinary future. The learning to drive one, the borrowing the car one, the ones I could not predict, and the ones I had imagined with the specific, desperate love of a mother who was given 11 days to hold everything she would ever feel. I stood at the kitchen counter and I thought about it all. And I cried, the way I had been trying to cry about Maya for 7 years and had never quite been able to, because the grief needed a space that was safe enough to be in fully, and I had not had a safe space for a very long time. I cried in the kitchen I designed myself, in the house I kept, in the morning of a day that was entirely mine, for a long time. And when I was done, I looked at her photograph and I said, "Good morning, baby," the way I say it every morning now, because she is not behind a locked door anymore. She is on the refrigerator, in the kitchen, where the light is right. I want to say something to you, directly, without distance between us, to the person watching this right now who has been told they are imagining things, not once, not in a single argument, but consistently, over long enough that the telling started to work, that you started running your own clearest perceptions through a filter before you trusted them, that you started asking yourself, am I too sensitive? Am I reading into this? Am I imagining this? Before you were allowed to feel anything. I need you to hear this. The filter is not yours. You did not build it out of weakness. You did not build it because you have anxiety or because you misread situations or because you are, as someone in your life has perhaps suggested, difficult. You built it because someone who was supposed to be safe, someone who was supposed to be the person who knew you best and wanted you well, taught you systematically, patiently over years that your perception was the problem. And the most dangerous thing about that teaching is how quietly it arrives. Not as cruelty, as concern, as gentle correction, as, I think you're reading into this, as you always do this, as I worry about you sometimes. Until the day you are sitting in a professional's office next to the person who built the filter inside you, and you are listening to them describe your tendency to misread situations, and part of you is nodding, because the filter has been running so long that it started to feel like your own thinking. It is not your thinking, it is theirs. And the moment you understand that distinction, the moment the filter stops working because you let yourself see what you can see clearly, that is when everything begins. Not the dinner, not the document, not the 60 days. The moment at the kitchen counter with the cold coffee when I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things and just looked. That moment cost me nothing except the willingness to trust what I already knew. I had that willingness my entire life. I had just been told not to use it. You have it too. You have always had it. Stop asking permission to use it. Start there. That is enough. That has always been enough. If this story reached something real in you tonight, if any part of it lived inside your own experience, drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from, your city, your state, your country. And tell me this, has anyone ever told you you were too sensitive and turned out to be exactly right? Drop it below. We read every single comment, everyone, without exception, because every location you drop and every story you share is proof that this community is real, that these stories matter, and that none of us are sitting in this alone. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because the next story coming to this channel is about a woman who found something in her mother-in-law's house that explained 14 years of her marriage in a single afternoon. You will not want to miss it. We will see you there.